Here we go. I was lucky enough this past summer, time capsule moment, to be around a ton of water. Whether that was at a cottage or a beach or a pool, even, it never ceased to mesmerize me. And yeah, you better believe I found some ways to sneak some art in. There's just something magical about water and totally inspirational. So let's dive deep and use water as our inspiration for our next set of watercolors. Start off by setting up your watercolor paper with 3 vertical canvas areas. Here's your prompt: horizon line, sky above, water below, but only using the color blue. So just like you, I'm painting this first one instinctually, and I'm painting it the way I would have before I learned anything about watercolor or anything about painting or drawing in general. We are all going to be at different points in our art, and we're all going to have different strengths and weaknesses, but we can all expand and improve and grow. And even though I'm an art teacher and an artist, I still have to really think about my art. It doesn't come particularly naturally to me. I'm committed to my art, and so I practice it and I work on it, and therefore I'm good at it. But I'm not as naturally gifted as even a lot of you. So push yourself, learn, strive, don't ever stop. Because art is a skill, not a gift you're born with. Okay, so here we go for real. We're going to start with the sky, and I'm starting out by adding just water into my horizon. Then I'm going to slowly build up a gradient, making my sky darker at the top of the page and lighter as it gets towards the horizon. Skies are naturally lighter the further away they are toward that horizon. So your vibrant blue will be at the top and your lightest blue will be closest to the horizon. Work up the color slowly. You can always add more color. You can always make it more saturated. It is more difficult to lighten it. Less truly is more. So right now I'm picking up a new brush, a dry brush, and I'm soaking up some of that wet paint. This is the thirsty brush technique, and I'm just trying to make the illusion of clouds. I'm just playing around with various brushes and trying to take away as much water and pigment as I can without also creating like pilling within the canvas. So now I move on to the water. Anything that is closer to us in illusion is going to be more saturated with color, crisper, more vibrant, and anything going off into the distance toward that horizon line is going to be softer, subtler, lighter. So this is a perfect time to use a graded wash from dark to light to give that real illusion of depth. So a very simple waterscape is really just a mirror reflection of one another. That dark gradient on the very top and the very bottom, slowly getting lighter as it moves towards the horizon. So now we're going to pick up a really diluted blue paint, and we're going to go about a third of the way up in our water and dance around some lines, some thin, some thick, all very watered down and light. This is the mid-range for our tone. Anything behind these lines will be very subtle and blurred. Anything in front of them will be gradually progressing darker and darker. This will help us to create the illusion of depth. At this point, we're focused less on shape, even though we think of the shape of a wave as being sort of a triangle or curved triangle. We are looking at some horizontal lines just sort of danced around the page and plopped into place. Don't overthink it. For this painting, I don't want you to think about highlights and lowlights. Instead, I want you to just make sure there are some small spaces between those lines. Those small spaces are naturally going to give us our highlights. And as I move further and further back, I'm going to get softer and more subtle with the color I'm using and the detail to my lines. So let's challenge ourselves to continually trying to get better. What we're going to do now is take the same concepts as we've previously learned and add some more. So step number 1 is we're going to drop that horizon. We're going to make these waves in this water look more realistic, even though we're going to have less of an area to make it look more realistic. Once the bottom is completely dry, I'll go in with just water across the entire top area where the sky will be, because I'm going to create a wash. Then I start applying my pigment, nice and slow. It's always easier to make something darker and more vibrant and saturated than it is to lighten it. So go slow. You can build up the color as you need to. But if it takes a while, that's completely fine. So once happy-ish with my gradient for the sky, I'm going to go in and start blotting out some cloud area. The best part of clouds is that the shape, size, texture, oh my goodness, it changes so frequently, and there are no rules. So work with what you have until you're happy. I did bring in a blow dryer, and this is one of the most effective tools for watercolor artists. You cannot move on until this section is completely dry. So now we're going to start going in with a new gradient. And the trick here is we're going to continue to use blue, but we're going to add in a drop of a new color. Can you pick up on what that new color is? That's right. It's orange. So complementary colors also tone one another. And toning means they're going to make them look a lot more realistic. So I'm going to use my blue and a subtle drop of orange in the same way that I did just my blue to create a bit of a gradient from dark to light toward the horizon line. One thing that's important is making sure that horizon line is defined but very subtle. It's a delicate balance. I'm also going to take the time to blow dry it again because I want this completely dry. It's beneficial to my overall composition. Now I'm playing with this addition of orange. I don't want my water or my clouds to be orange, so I'm certainly not going crazy with it. I'm going to use that same muddy blue that I've created by adding in a bit of the orange, and I'm going to give the bottoms of my clouds some lowlights, some shadows. I'm mixing on a separate palette, and I'm using just the tiniest tip or edge of my brush. I'm not pushing into the brush. Not all the bristles are touching down. We're just touching, it's just a dot. And a great tip is to move your hands further away. The key here is an extremely gentle, delicate touch, along with extremely diluted paint. Your paint should basically be dirty water at this point. It should be so diluted and watered down that there's hardly any pigment in it. So play around with these clouds, but I really encourage you to step away from your art and look at it from across the room. We are so close to our art when we're creating it, and art is never viewed that closely. Sometimes stepping away makes it come all together or makes you see the issues. It can really give you a lot of clarity. So here we go again, creating some texture in the waves. This time I have mixed my blue with a little bit of orange. I'm still starting about a third of the way down, and I'm creating very diluted, very watered down lines. They're always easier to darken up, and I'm going left to right. I'm putting different amounts of pressure into the brush, but for the most part, I'm just touching the tiniest amount of pigment into this very dry scene because, as you remember, I dried this completely. Get some really thin lines in, get some thicker ones, get some jagged edges, and play around. I know that I'm going to be building up to more saturated intensities of this very bluey turquoise that I've developed, but that does not have to happen quickly. I'm playing around with the lines. The ones I like, I might saturate with a bit more color. The ones I don't like, I might fade out. But I'm making sure to keep space between those sections of the line. I want there to be a definition. And they're definitely getting smaller. And at the back, if I'm even giving any definition, it's a dot or two. We are not going into massive amounts of definition back there because that is so far away. There's no way we could see any sort of wave ripple. We might see a tiny bit of color contrast, but barely even that. So now I'm going to go in with lowlights. I'm taking a darker consistency of what I was already working with. This is still not a fully pigmented version of the paint. I'm not taking it directly from the paint palette. I'm taking diluted versions of the paint palette of blue and orange mixed together. It looks dark in comparison to the rest of the painting, but it's still very muted in comparison to the actual dark pigmentation of those watercolor pigments. It's still very watered down. And now I'm focusing on a bit of realism, which is that waves are darker looking on the bottom than they are on the top. This just comes down to where the light is hitting them. So I'm trying to bring up this concept of a wave by putting a slightly darker edge to any of my very defined lines and taking the time again to dry everything. This sounds crazy, but once everything is dry, I'm going back in with the tip of my brush and only water to try and scrub off some of the paint. What I'm trying to do here is create some very delicate highlights. It's difficult to see. It's subtle. It may or may not seem like it makes a difference, but it makes a difference. I don't know how to tell you. The other thing you can do in this point is soften any of those really hard edges, those really hard lines or angles. Soften them out because water is never rigid. This process takes a long time and is extremely subtle and maybe has the least amount of reward, but it's also the type of technique that is going to elevate your artwork so much more. It's going to make it look so much more realistic, so much more detailed, so much more advanced.